Warning, this episode is rated M, and is intended for mature audiences only. Viewer discretion is advised. The following is the first part of the 4th episode of the first season of Dire. This episode is entitled, The Most Selfless Form of Evil. This is the Season 1 finale of Dire. This episode was released on the 31st of January 2021. Beginning in 3, 2, 1. She'll be fine, she just needs to rest for a bit. Though much is muffled, these words are heard in their entirety as Alex begins stirring up from her daze. Through quiet and barely noticeable grunts, Alex lifts herself to a halfway seated position before Kennedy rushes over to her bedside with the look of pure joy written all over her face. "Hey Kenny," Alex says through a wide smile before being approached by Jaime, allowing her to rest the palm of her hands on both of her children's cheeks for the first time in what feels like ages. Standing directly behind Jaime, Jordan watches on with a slight smile on his face at the reunion between the girls before Alex reaches out for him and wraps him in a hug, thanking him for keeping Jaime and Kennedy safe in the process. Beginning to slowly walk out into the hallway, Kayla and Chevy are halted in their tracks as Jaime calls out for them, motioning for them to come over. As they start slowly walking up to the newly reunited family, Jaime explains that it was the two of them that suggested opening the back door whilst everyone else argued against it. "They saved your lives," Jaime says, prompting Alex to struggle to her feet before embracing the two of them as well, thanking them for keeping everyone safe as well. As Alex breaks the hug, Chevy nods his head and flicks the free hair from his face whilst Kayla begins to show the signs of a slight smile forming in the corner of her mouth. "How's David?" Alex asks, only for her answer to come in the form of the man walking through the doorway and up to Alex, hugging her before telling her that he was happy for her. "I don't mean to be the one to break up this lovely moment," Chevy says from the back of the room, "but we're still a little over an hour away from getting flooded out by acid rain. And all of the windows in this place have been blown to dust." "How long have I been out?" Alex asks. "A little bit less than an hour," answers Kayla. "Healthy or not, we've gotta start getting on the move. This building may not be too stable for much too long," David says, only for the sound of shattering glass to begin ringing out from the main lobby, drawing the attention of everyone. "What the hell?" Jaime says before Jordan rushes ahead of the group and up to the doorway before disappearing into the hall. Hurrying after him, Chevy, Kayla and David follow and search for the source of the noise, only to find nothing but smoke and dust in the area of the building once used as the entrance. "Probably just the window falling out of place," David says, only for Jordan to shrug off the notion and continue walking forward. As he nears closer to the gaping wound of the front of the building, he begins squinting at a building in the near distance in hopes of seeing past the plumes of smoke. As David and Kayla look on, Chevy begins cautiously walking forward, only to suddenly break out into a sprint before lunging full speed into Jordan, tackling him to the ground as a gunshot rings throughout the air, missing Jordan and Chevy by a few feet before piercing the stomach of David, and ripping through and out the other side. As Chevy and Jordan slide into one of the many damaged marble pillars, Kayla hurls herself at David and drops the two of them to the ground and behind a pile of concrete chunks from the collapsed building as a second gunshot intended for David embeds itself into the ground. Standing to their feet, Jordan and Chevy both take cover behind broken tables and folding chairs as Chevy arms himself, firing 2 rounds into the direction of the shooter, only for his attempts at scaring the individual responsible to be met with another gunshot aimed in his direction. "Stay back," Jordan shouts at Jaime, her sister and her mother as he notices them rush from the cover of their back room, giving them enough notice to duck out of the way of yet another round fired off into their direction. "Anyone know where he's shooting from?" Chevy yells out, only for a 5th bullet to be fired directly into a massive mirror-like wall at the back of the lobby, shattering it into pieces as if to assure the continued lack of an answer to the question. However, luck finds Chevy's way as a panel of glass relatively unharmed still shows the burst of light from the end of the rifle across the street and through the smoke a few stories up well enough for Chevy to briefly prop himself up from behind cover to send a shot directly at the gunman, however unfazing him as yet another shot is sent into the mirror-like installation at the back of the lobby, this time forcing enough damage to obstruct Chevy's view completely. Regardless, Chevy still has his sights on where he knows the gunman to be, allowing him the brief moment to duck from behind cover and send a second shot at the gunman. This time earning an audible grunt of pain from his direction, which allows for Chevy to order Jordan out from cover and back to Jaime and her family. "How's he looking, Kayla?" Chevy calls out to no response. "Kayla?" Chevy calls out again, once more earning no response. As Chevy's eyes begin bulging open, his face begins shaking with anger before he bursts up and out of cover, dodging one bullet after another before throwing himself behind the collapsed debris. Both David and Kayla take refuge behind. There he finds Kayla unconscious with a deep gash on the back of her head, suffered after crashing headfirst onto downed chunks of concrete she was unfortunate enough to find break her fall. Ripping his jacket and shirt off, Chevy musters through the cold as he begins wrapping the short-sleeved t-shirt around his girlfriend's head, applying enough pressure to hopefully stop the bleeding. Once bullets continue firing again, Chevy leaps from cover and sends another 2 bullets flying in the direction of the gunman, earning yet another grunt of pain twice before the sound of a gun crashing against the pavement begins ringing aloud. Noticing the moment, Jordan hurries through the lobby and into the street before navigating his way through the thick cloud of rubble. "Jaime!" Chevy calls out, immediately bringing Jaime rushing up to his side as the two begin helping both Kayla and a badly wounded David into the safety of the lobby hallway. Without anything visible and no landmarks to help him find his way, Jordan appears lost in the hope-draining cloud of disparity. With nothing to go off of, Jordan continues stumbling forward in hopes of walking into something that can help him eventually until he feels a hand grab him by the shoulder and forcefully spin him around. Turning, Jordan notices a gas mask before the reality-inducing strike of a punch to the face knocks him onto his ass. Trying to help himself back to his feet, Jordan feels the brunt of a few swift kicks to the stomach continue to keep him down as he notices the man appearing to be dressed from head to toe in complete army garb. Suddenly, the combat-driven maniac drops onto Jordan before beginning to rain one punch after another onto the poor soul lost in the dust. After a few attempts at shielding himself from the strikes, Jordan propels his knee from the ground and straight below the belt of the individual attempting to deliver his fate to him, draining him of his power long enough for Jordan to get a direct strike to the throat dropping the soldier like lunatic to the ground beside him. Finding it within himself, Jordan staggers to his feet before noticing the man attempting to propel himself forward and lunging at his helmet, tugging and pulling at it before finally freeing it from the man and placing it over his own head. Suddenly, Jordan finds himself in the driver's seat as he drops the man to the ground with a final knee strike to the face. Keeping an eye locked onto the man, whose face he still cannot get a fair enough glimpse of, Jordan slowly stumbles backwards before tripping over something and collapsing onto the harsh pavement below. Looking forward, Jordan notices the rifle laying out in the middle of the street before attempting to reach for it, only to be kicked in the mouth by the rejuvenated man in return for his actions. Rather than retrieve the gun, the man decides to return to the towering position, taking a stance over Jordan and raining down one strike after another in hopes of taking out the resilient man on his second attempt. However, after a few well-placed blocks, Jordan frees one of his arms enough to reach into his belt loop and retrieve a hidden blade, which he picks the perfect opportunity moments later to drive directly into the side of his would-be killer. Finally able to catch his breath, Jordan rips the knife from the side of the madman he had escaped by the skin of teeth with his life by fighting off, and crawls over to the gun, picking it up and rushing out of the thick smoke with it in the direction of his group. Crawling on the ground, the still unrecognizable man slithers back to the building he started firing for minutes earlier and disappears through the shattered front doors into a pitch-black void of nothing. Rushing forward with every ounce of strength he has, Jordan hurries through the blanket-like smoke in the direction of his group until he runs into Jaime, who grabs onto his arm and leads him the rest of the way. Finally rushing back into the lobby, Jaime and Jordan hurry to the back room and regroup with their fellow survivors, who quickly ready themselves to evacuate the building before the sound of marble cratering into the lobby floor begins spelling out the imminent future of the office floors above them. "We gotta get out of here, now!" Chevy shouts at the top of his lungs, carrying a still unconscious Kayla in his arms before beginning to lead the group's attempt at evacuating the area. As the 7 survivors burst out into the backlit of the building, windows begin shattering overhead as the top 3 floors begin caving in, escaping out into the smoke-filled streets. The remaining floors of the office building crumble to a heap into the ground floor whilst the survivors barely manage to escape into the early morning with their lives intact. You fill a void in others that aren't devoted enough to fill the void within you, Jaime. Tapping her long, press-on like nails against the edge of the armrest of the chair she finds herself sinking further into with every waking breath. Jaime allows herself the ability to refuse the acknowledgement of Kate's presence. Despite, or rather in spite of this reaction from the woman seated before her, Kate continues preaching to the choir as if the events unfolding were bound to reveal themselves as true psychological miracles. You hate yourself and you don't want to allow anyone to fill that void in your heart because you have deemed yourself too unworthy of that fulfillment. Pressing the skin of her thumb up to her soft, supple lips and facing her attention to the window beside her, Kate simply keeps her eyes devoted to keeping attention on Jaime's expression through the corner of her eyelids. You only allow yourself the fulfillment of helping others through their troubles because you have convinced yourself that the only way towards redemption is by allowing your own personal suffering to be the positive light in the worlds that other people revolve around. Remaining unfazed, Jaime remains seated with her eyes dead set on remaining planted on the thick coating of plaster the drywall in front of her is covered in. You are the sacrificial lamb bringing happiness and joy to people that you believe deserve it more than you. And that, Jaime. Pausing for a brief moment as she notices the woman finally place her eyes in her general direction, Kate allows a smile to establish itself across her face before concluding. And that, Jaime, is the one thing that you believe will allow you to both suffer and redeem yourself at the same time. Eyebrow raised, Kate has her attention. Like a starving fish noticing a worm dangling precariously in the midst of the sea, Jaime takes the bait. She bites. And what would that be then, Miss Kate? Leaning forward, arms planted on both armrests, Kate's smile becomes completely impossible to ignore. A martyr. As neither side decides to give in and break the silence between the two parties, Kate and Jaime simply stare at each other for eons, awaiting the first sign of one or the other, ready to be the first to give in and start reeling in the line. However, it would be neither woman claiming that victory, or rather loss, as the sound of Mother Nature bestilling her wrath upon the earth would hoist above that designated trophy with the sudden, booming roar of thunder. Suddenly, a few single raindrops ringing against the metal air conditioning unit would turn into a rainstorm just out of reach from the two women remaining engaged in silent warfare. Where do we go now? Kennedy asks, still struggling alongside her mother in hopes of keeping David on his feet. With each step kicking up the dirt of a building having claimed the lives of, perhaps thousands, the 7 survivors lucky to still retain their lives suddenly duck down into a long, winding alleyway in hopes of alternative salvation. Keep moving, Jordan shouts, lugging with him the rifle and gas mask of the man having recently come so close to taking their lives away from them. Behind here, Chevy shouts from ahead, only to collapse into a large, prison yard-like backlit directly beside a rundown factory. Following suit, the rest of the group hunkers down behind the frost-covered metal doors of a loading dock in hopes of it serving as a safe enough shelter to avoid gunfire from. After a few moments of rest, Chevy's most likely concussed girlfriend begins groaning from beside him, reaching for the back of her head despite Chevy's warning to avoid aggravating the still fresh wound. Moving his hand behind her head, Chevy smiles as he notices his girlfriend return the favor by placing her hand over his. Moving his lips to hers, Chevy brings his opposite hand to her cheek before sinking further into the kiss. So what do you do for fun? Asks the woman to his right, wearing sunglasses large enough to conceal her eyes, but small enough to notice her eyebrow raised. Laughing, a clean-shaven, leather jacket-less Chevy improvises. I make other people smile. Giggling and responding in a sarcastic way, Kayla goes silent for a brief second before asking seriously, and earning a chuckle of her own from her still somehow rugged-looking date for the day. Walking past a well-lit Ferris wheel, and noticing a few children rushing past them with water guns in tow, Chevy looks back towards the woman beside her and assures her of his genuinity. Your method of fun is to make people smile. Nodding with his lips puckered, Kayla cannot truly determine whether or not the man beside her is offended or selfless enough to allow her to laugh at the expense of his pastime. Indeed, it is. Mouth agape, Kayla's lower jaw closes before she nods and begins looking around the park until she feels the gentle nudge of Chevy's elbow prodding at her own. Pointing in the direction of a dunk tank employee, Chevy explains his true reasoning. "You see that guy in the tank? Do you think he'd rather stand around and wait for some poor sap to stumble across his ring toss game rather than sit on a chair and wait to get thrown into a tub of lukewarm water on a hot Los Angeles-like summer day? Of course he does. Who the hell wants his gig?" Laughing, Kayla continues nodding in assumption that the explanation was over, only to be caught by surprise as Chevy further explains. But he sits there with a smile on his face and high-fives the kids trying to soak him in the bubbling tub of what is most likely half rainwater, because he knows those kids want to have a good day. Pausing for a moment and taking Kayla by the hand, only in order to stop her in place as the same man being discussed is dunked once again and yet still gives the children a high-five and congratulates them on their accomplishment. Watching further, the kids skip away with their parents and smile further down the pier this carnival adventure is taking place on with their days having been made. You see, people can go through hell on any given day. With another pause, Kayla turns to face Chevy, who returns the favor by doing the same to her. Mountains can crumble, disasters can hit, and tears can be shed. But there's always a brief moment of joy in every one of those hardships when you're made to feel human again. And people treat you as nothing less. Of course, you'll relapse back into the reminder that everything around you is falling into total disrepair. But you won't feel alien to the sensitive touch of the good that humanity is always going to be capable of. Staring into each other's eyes, a slight, yet noticeable smile on both of their faces, Chevy breaks a moment short when he looks to the ground and begins shaking his head, apologizing for getting too deep and making the moment uncomfortable. However, before he can be made to feel like any more of a good-hearted optimist, Kayla leans into him and shares a kiss. One that breaks the uncomfortable worry of having been responsible for ruining a good moment before the roaring sound of thunder is overheard. With sparse raindrops quickly followed by a rainstorm forcing the couple to rush for cover. Suddenly, the roaring sound of thunder breaks the kiss between the two as Jaime reminds everyone of the impending acidic rain threatening their survival. Looking around the area, Jaime notices the empty factory entryway directly in front of them before suggesting they take cover inside as they wait the rainstorm out. After a few moments of looking around for anyone to suggest a better idea, the group begins readying themselves to take temporary residency within their newly decided upon sanctuary. However, after a few steps towards the building, David collapses to his knees and remains clutching at his still bullet-penetrated abdomen. Kneeling beside him, Alex lifts up his shirt to reveal a massive loss of blood before the man falls onto his back on the asphalt below them, gasping for air. "David, you need to keep fighting, okay?" Alex asks, only earning repetitive "I can't" responses growing fainter with each failing gasp for air. "Think about your daughter, David. Think about what she would need from you if she were here right now." Shaking his head and trying to speak through the blood slowly filling his mouth with each attempt at breathing, David quietly and faintly explains. "I couldn't save her. When I had the chance. I wouldn't be able to help her now. Even if I wanted to." Not buying it for a second, Alex continues to plead. David, you helped me get this far. You fought all this way for something to believe in and here it is. You need to keep fighting, David." Shaking his head, and reaching towards Alex with his hand, unable to stop crying tears of both sadness and joy, David faintly responds. "Fight now. Or no fight now. I'm still going to die." Now sobbing uncontrollably, Alex fights back the tears streaming from her eyes and down the smooth cheeks now blushing a bright red from the cold to repeatedly plead for David. "I need you. I still need you. Say it." The voice of a man, pissed off beyond recognition, begins ordering at a woman with tears streaming down her face powerful enough to begin erasing the makeup from directly below her eyes, revealing bumps and bruises. I. The hesitation in his voice is not enough, and it never was enough. lifting his foot in the air and holding it there for long enough to add that much more pressure when dropped. The man crushes the hand of the woman below the sole of his boot and against the hardwood flooring of their living room. The woman, screeching in pain, desperately pulls at her hand in hopes of freeing it from the boot's crushing weight as the demand of her is continued to be heard throughout the halls of their home in rage-filled fits of screaming and shouting. "I need you. I will always need you," the woman shouts over and over again, hoping that each attempt will be enough to convince the man towering above her to free her from her shackles. Finally, the man lifts his foot, and the woman's hand shoots out from beneath it like a rocket, finding comfort within the chest of herself as she tries to keep the shattered bones within it from spilling out of the contusion-like cuts plaguing her skin like patterns on a quilt. Speechless, and allowing for her gasps for pleading less air to do the talking for her, the woman raises her face towards that of the man above her. It's Alex, and lowering his face towards hers, Robert places his finger to his lips and ushers for Alex to quiet down. In the hospital room, Alex is placed in a massive cast, covering the entire length of her hand and most of her forearm as she is being released from the emergency room. In the car on the ride home, Robert drives with one hand steering as the other rests below his chin. No words are spoken, and the environment still feels hostile despite the time that has passed. Tearing up, it's Robert that breaks the silence first. "I just can't figure you out, why Kano?" Remaining frozen like stone, staring on at the road as if to admit her current state of mind is just counting down the yards to go before she can return to her home. Alex just sits there as Robert keeps talking. "You do this thing to me. You just won't stop making me angry and I don't know why you keep doing this." Now sobbing at his deluded, unstable and delusional conclusions, Alex just stares onwards with her mouth agape until she notices the car begin to slow before coming to a stop on the side of the road, forcing her mouth further open as tears begin streaming down her face once again, just at a slower pace this time. "You know that you piss me off and it's like you just don't care. You just keep asking for this and make me feel horrible about myself. Like this is what you wanted." Silent, Alex continues to listen as Robert asks the same question over and over again. "Is this what you wanted?" Finally, Robert screams the question one final time before Alex completely breaks down in tears, responding with one simple word over and over again through the tears streaming onto her lips and the saliva packing itself in her mouth. "No." There the two sit, sobbing for two very different reasons before Robert reaches out and rests his arm behind Alex's head before nestling his head into her shoulder and whispering to her, "I can't afford to lose you now. Please, David. Please try to fight." Spitting the blood pooling in his mouth, David plants his hands against the remorseless asphalt surface and struggles mightily against the fight of his life draining away to pick himself up to his knees. "Are you ready?" Jaime asks over to the gravely wounded man, who slowly nods through the pain of every muscle in his body growing stiff. Stranding to their feet, the group begins confidently marching towards the front doors of the Wavering Hills Industrial Workhouse before a faint plea for attention emanates from directly behind them. Hey you guys!" From the entrance of the alleyway, a man in street casual attire lugging a backpack over his shoulder begins rushing towards the group with a creepy smile across his face. Noticing the possible danger looming, Chevy releases the gun from his back and aims it towards the man, ordering him to refuse any steps further. "Whoa. Okay. No worries over here," the man says, raising his hands into the air with his smile still remaining, only being slightly hidden behind an ingenuine look of concern. Slowly inching to the side, Chevy hands a still weak Kayla off to Jaime whilst keeping the gun pointed on the man. "What do you want?" Chevy asks, simple and to the point. "Well," the survivor says, "to find some place safe to stay and wait out the rainstorm." That's a good start. Growing increasingly protective, Chevy keeps discussions pinpointed towards the brass tacks. "Find somewhere else. The factory is ours." Still raising his hands into the air, the man's concern grows lesser, and an expression eerily similar to confidence begins showing itself. "Oh, come on. You can't spare any room for one more person?" "No, it's too dangerous right now to let your guard down." "We're not going to, and neither should you." Find somewhere else and hope you get lucky. Chevy keeps his eyes still, locked onto the possible threat with full attention. Suddenly, his eyes squint as the man adds another branch to the conversation. I have supplies. You're welcome to treat yourselves to it. Suddenly, the group's attention is piqued, and the obvious question is asked by Alex. Anything medical? Chuckling quietly before responding very lightheartedly, the man responds. That's what most of the bag is for. Now smiling from ear to ear, the man latches onto Alex's attention before asking. Bandages, rubbing alcohol, disinfectant. You name it, I've got some of it. Still propping Kayla up on her feet, Jaime struggles to keep the woman at bay as she refuses to accept any further help, now grabbing onto the wall at the side of the stairway for support. Freeing Jaime for long enough to get a good look at the man's face. Squinting her eyes, she notices something about the man that seems familiar. Despite the feeling, Jaime cannot quite remember where she knows the man from. Going to reach into his bag, Chevy orders him to stop any further movements, prompting the survivor to place his hands into the air once again. This time high enough for the man's shirt to begin rising above his stomach. Taking a closer look, Jordan notices a bandage covering a rather large wound on the man's side. Subtly inching closer to the man, Jordan looks towards his feet to see combat boots on. Suddenly, the picture becomes clearer. As Jordan continues inching closer, Chevy and Alex agree to allow the man the brief opportunity to reach into his bag and retrieve the bandages and rubbing alcohol he claimed to have. However, before the man can retrieve anything from his bag, a voice from behind the group speaks up. It's Jaime taking a few steps forward and calling out a name. Eli, right? The man's attention returns to the woman whose voice called out the name, prompting another eerie smile to spread across his face like a wildfire before breaking the brief pause to continue reaching into his bag. We've met before, right? Jaime asks, with Eli nodding in response. Yes. Yes, we have. Turning back to face the woman, still sporting a Glasgow smile-like expression, Eli pulls his hand out of his bag and aims a gun towards Jaime, only to be tackled from his side by Jordan, causing the gun to fire off at Chevy being knocked off course, and sending a bullet through his hand, forcing him to drop the gun to the ground. With the sound of gunfire ringing through the lot, JM orders both Alex and Kennedy to carry David into the factory. Struggling on the ground, Jordan and Eli begin trading blows at each other before Eli kicks the gas mask-wearing man off of him and retrieves a blade, pulling Jordan to his feet as he holds him hostage at knife point, ordering Jaime to drop the gun he now finds her to be wielding. You've taken lives before, Jaime. I know that. But you've never done it yourself. I also know, you've never used a gun before, so drop it or risk causing another one to be lost as well. Staring down the woman in front of him, Eli continues to wear the smile as he awaits Jaime's decision. Slowly inching her finger to the trigger, Jaime lets out a long, deep breath before pulling on it, only to find no bullet leave the chamber. Pulling once more, she realizes that the gun is jammed, and holds no power over the man balancing the life of her boyfriend on the tip of a blade. Smiling at the revelation, Eli begins laughing hysterically. As his laughter dies out, Eli shrugs and lets out a breath of disappointment. Well, Eli says, I guess it's less fun than I had imagined it when you're helpless to do anything about it. Running the blade to his throat. Jordan feels the pressure on his jugular built before he is swept off of his feet and sent crashing against the ground alongside Eli. A few inches out of reach, Jordan crawls away from the man who has now almost killed him multiple times before noticing the dumpster that had been sent flying into them that ultimately kept him alive. Behind that dumpster is Kayla, who emerges from cover and bursts at full speed towards the stairwell, motioning for everyone to get inside whilst they still could. Flying through the front doors, the remaining survivors dive into the main hall before pulling the doors shut and hoping that the locks installed do their jobs long enough. Gasping for air, the group begins rushing further into the factory whilst Kayla and Kennedy stay ahead of the pack, keeping an eye on the door. Still in the lot, Eli pulls himself to his feet and retrieves his gun from the ground, slamming it against the stone wall beside it a few times before reloading a new cartridge into it. Marching up to the front doors of the factory, Eli begins laying in kicks to it as the rustic locks begin slowly bending under the pressure of each boot delivered. Noticing this, Kayla and Kennedy both return to the group and begin looking for places to hide until settling upon a rundown locker room. Looking through, Kayla directs Kennedy straight ahead, where she fits her into a stuffy locker at the front of the room. "Hey, listen to me. I'm going to be in the locker right next to you, okay? You and I aren't going anywhere without each other, and I will not leave you behind. I need you to stay calm, okay?" Taking a deep breath, Kennedy nods in response before offering his fist out to Kayla, who returns with a fist bump before closing the door and taking residency in the locker directly beside Kennedy just as promised. A few seconds after the locker doors shut, the doors finally cave in and Eli slowly begins stepping further into the building. Keeping an eye aimed down the hallway, Jordan and Jaime both hide out in a janitor's closet directly opposite the entrance. Eli finds himself scouring. Before closing the door, Jordan looks to the other side of the room and nods at Alex and David, who crouch behind a conveyor belt leading out from one of the manufacturing sections. Located further down the hall is an empty office that Chevy finds himself hunkered down in, halfway between the main foyer and the rest of the group not named Kayla or Kennedy. Cautiously looking at every end of what's visible from his perspective, Eli continues further into the building with each step crunching down on shattered bits of glass. Come out, wherever it is you may be, little chickens," Eli says aloud, hoping to antagonize someone enough for them to show themselves. "Oh, are we shy?" Eli asks. "Do we not like talking to people we perceive to be strangers?" After another brief pause, Eli sighs before grabbing a metal folding chair and placing it down in the main foyer, directly opposite of the end of the populated hallway. "Okay, fine. I guess I should introduce myself." Releasing the magazine from his gun before loading it once again, Eli calls out for one person in specific to take great notes on what he is about to say. "I truly hope David is listening. I think I have something to say that he might like to hear. Something that makes it clear to him just what kind of people he is surrounding himself with. Maybe the broad and biker guy will take interest too." Leaning forward in his chair, Eli bites his lip and rakes his teeth against it before starting. "My name is Eli. Many people call me Elijah." Using his gun as a sort of laser pointer, Eli begins waving it around in the air before beginning to loosen up into a more animated sort of character. "But David," Eli says before taking a moment to glance down into the seemingly never-ending hallway. "David may recognize me by my full, legal name. Elijah William Northcott." Still clutching at his wound, David's hands tremble anxiously at the revelation of the man's true identity. He turns to face the woman beside him, watching her as she starts piecing two and two together as well. "And your beloved leader, your fearless director of operations, killed my daughter." Turning to face his girlfriend, Jordan looks on with a blank face as Jaime simply looks on, anticipating his next statement. You see, Jaime owns a company that, well, became pretty popular. It let high school classmates talk to each other about whatever it is they so chose. But amongst many other things, ladies and gentlemen, allowed you to let everyone know when and where you or someone else was hosting a party. Looking towards the hallway, noticing an open door amongst the many closed ones lining the walls, Eli takes an educated guess and speaks directly in its direction. There was a whole part of the app that was solely dedicated just for that. And you better believe me when I tell you, kids took advantage. Staring at the wall in front of him, Chevy bites his lip, clutching at a large metal plate, anticipating Eli to continue his conversation with the empty air. Meanwhile, Kennedy stares through the slits of the locker door and directly at the gun-wielding, vengeance-seeking, fate-controlling psychopath at the front of the building with a look of distress. Whilst Kayla feels the dread of knowing something bad is bound to happen with every wave of frost-like air that enters through her only viewpoint to the outside. And my daughter was one of them.